My name's Daniel McCaffrey, and I've noticed a proposal to put a light rail system from the centre of Auckland to the airport down Dominion Road and through a number of other streets on its way to the airport. Let me tell you a few ideas about this. I worked at Auckland International Airport between 1990 and 1996, and one of my jobs was at one point the statistics officer. So I gathered all the statistics for the airport, which are voluminous, I can assure you. I was then in charge of car parks and then in charge of all the shops. And being the statistics officer, I was given a task to survey and establish how people got to the airport, what trends there would be in future, and how we should lay out our forecourts and how we should plan parking, and all the other complications that arrive at the front of an airport when people arrive at it. And I took a lot of trouble over that. The first thing I discovered was that the mode of transport in some cases depended on who was paying for it. A lot of people were going on business, government business, travelling overseas on business, or someone else was paying their transport costs, or they'd bought an international ticket or some arrangement with transfer costs included. So they were going to go the most comfortable way that they could. The second thing I established was that cars were obviously the most preferred method, but there was also the airport bus and rental cars and people dropping off their friends and people dropping off their car in the car park and going to Wellington or whatever. And then I dug further into the matter and looked at who they were. Were they family? Were they travelling overseas? Were they travelling domestically? And all of these things were very important factors on how they came to the airport and why they used a particular mode of transport. So let me tell you what will happen with the light rail after the $700 million is spent on it. It will be hardly used at all. Now, one of the reasons is that if you're leaving from Te Atatu to go to the airport, well, you could dive round through the new fancy Waterview tunnel and you can arrive at the airport in no time flat. The alternative, if you're going to catch this tram, light rail, is that you've got to walk to your bus stop in Te Atatu and then you've got to catch the bus or the train to the Auckland Central Station. And then you've got to wait there until the airport tram pulls out, and you've got to sit on the tram as it stops at every stop. What do you think people are going to do? The other is if you're in a nice hotel downtown at someone else's expense, you're not going to walk down and try and find the railway station and then hop on this tram which will trudge down Dominion Road, stopping at every stop. The other thing I've actually investigated is I've ridden on the train, it's not a tram, a train, to the Sydney airport from downtown. Most uncomfortable voyage. That train's going on to Cronulla and stopping at all sorts of places in the interim, and it's primarily for local passengers. They're coming home from work, they're going to work, and a whole lot of people on board with suitcases doesn't work because an airport bus has a provision for suitcases, but a tram will not, because if you have provision for suitcases and luggage, you'll lose about 7-10 seats in every carriage, and that's money. And the commuters won't be terribly happy with you and your suitcases and the whole regalia as you go out to the airport. If you're coming from the North Shore, again, you've got to catch some means of transport to the central station and then sit on the train, a tram, with all these commuters as you make it out to the airport. I checked the Brisbane train. It was easy. I sat there for about 6 hours watching who caught it. Hardly anybody catches it. It's a hell of a lot more convenient to catch a shuttle, a taxi, an Uber, a bus, or have your mates pick you up, or take the car that you left at the airport and go home in that. It's enormously convenient to take point-to-point transport, because the problem with rails and trams is they're like the old telephone system, When you rang London, you occupied a line from Auckland to London, only you were sort of using it from point to point. Roadways and motorways are like the internet. You can take any road you like from Te Atatu, down around the back of Queen's Gate, whatever, to the airport. If you're leaving from Panmure, well, you can go round the back. You don't have to catch a train from Panmure to the city and then sit on this tram to the airport. And I know it'll be a failure. It'll be even worse than Toronto. Toronto's a case in point. They decided, as public people do, to build a metro line to the airport. It's a catastrophe. Cost about 400 and something million. Now remember, this metro didn't disrupt traffic for 2 years while it was being built. It was a railway line. And the 2 years disturbance while they build that thing down Dominion Road and on out to the airport is going to be colossal. And the subsidy was $29 per passenger. Now, recently, they've dropped the fares and they've managed to get the subsidy down to $11 per passenger. Every passenger costs the citizens $11. Used to cost 29 Canadian dollars. Secondly, they got as many as 49 people per tram. They've got usage up to 9,000 a month. It's thoroughly pathetic, and it's an embarrassment to the city of Toronto. Now, Toronto's got 9 million people living in what they call the Golden Horseshoe. It's an area around Ontario, Toronto, and verging up to Ottawa, well, perhaps that far. And Toronto Airport gets 40 million passengers. Pearce Airport's 40 million odd passengers a year. Auckland gets 16 million. The hinterland around Auckland, what? 1.82 million at the very, very most, and that might be trained in Whangarei, Hamilton and Tauranga. The difference and remember that Toronto was a train, lost a hell of a lot of money, loses money every week it's on, and has that vast area to draw 9 million people from. And secondly, Toronto, with 40 million passengers, the number of passengers arriving by rail with this lovely new-built metro line can only be about 1% at the very, very most. And that's an airport that serves a vast conurbation of 80 million people between Boston and Washington, Chicago, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, all those cities. Auckland, well, it's 1,200 miles anywhere. The nearest population northward is Fiji at about 900,000. And true, you go to Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, which would have about, 12 million in them. But it's really nowhere. So light rail to the airport, we can guarantee it'll be a money-losing, inconvenient disaster. So why would they want to do it? Well, politically it's a real winner. You see, you get to have foundation stones and there's ribbon-cutting ceremonies and vast publicities. They built this new ancient 19th century form of transport to the airport. Because if you were doing this through a public company, if a public company decided it wanted to build a light rail along the streets to the airport, well, they would have to get a prospectus together. The figures in the prospectus would have to give some indication that the number of riders would pay for the $700 million plus that it was going to cost. You'd have to convince the board of the company that was proposing it. You'd have to prospectus to the Financial Management Authority in Wellington. And then you'd have to go and find the money and convince the banks and financiers and your shareholders that this was a goer. And you wouldn't be able to do that based on Toronto, based on Brisbane, based on Sydney. This idea was going anywhere. But if it's politics, well, it's a whole different game. I don't know many councils around Auckland. Let's say there's 17, for argument's sake. You only got to convince 10 people in a room who are probably like you, thinking that tram lines are the way of the future, and they hate cars anyway. You've got to convince a cabinet, if central government puts in money, you've got to convince 10 people, again, 10 out of 18. And if you get those votes, you get the money. Treasury will sign a cheque That's the political side of it. And you'll be out of office long gone by the time the fiasco is uncovered, and people find that this is a complete clunker. Now, it's true that light rail might be some benefit, although the same argument goes as a commuting line from the central city down to Roskilde, Hunga, wherever. But Auckland's a very spread out city, and people have many, many alternatives of transporting themselves about. And particularly in an airport, if you spent $3,000 on an overseas ticket going somewhere, well, the $30 for the cab fare, the $50, the Uber fare, the getting the bus, giving $20 to your mate to drop you off at the airport, that all makes so much better sense than risking missing your flight. So there you are, based on Toronto's experience, which was a dedicated rail line. I mean, if they really wanted to go half pie crazy, they could build a line over there from Papatoetoe through, virgin land, basically, to the airport, and they'd find out that didn't work, but it wouldn't cost quite so much money. It wouldn't cause catastrophic traffic problems while it was being built, and then taking up the central lane of Dominion Road. If you want to see how that works, have a look at the road out from Richmond and Melbourne to the eastern suburbs. It takes up, Melbournians love their trams, and it's a nostalgic thing. But they're an absolute bloody nuisance as regards getting anybody anywhere and soaking up a whole space that cars could be in. Cars do work. So there you are. It's just a political thing. If they get those 10 people in the room in the city of Auckland and 10 people in the New Zealand cabinet, it'll all be off to the races. There'll be ribbons cut. There'll be a glorious effort. But that $795 million will be taken out of taxpayers' and ratepayers' pockets. And I'm sure a whole lot of them had plans for that money before it was ripped out for a vanity project for the Greens and the Labour Party. They could have, put shoes on their children, petrol in their cars, groceries on their tables, sent the kids to college. Any number of things they could have done with the money which would have benefited themselves and the country, rather than digging up a vast hole and pouring this money into a long-term, non-functional, money-losing prospect such as light rail to the airport. Well, there you are. Still think it's a good idea?